My parents erased me from the will. Then I found the secret folder. I found out I had been erased from my father's will on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting in a lawyer's office that smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, wearing the same black dress I had worn to his funeral 4 days earlier. I remember the exact sound the air conditioning made, a low rattling hum, because I focused on it so hard while the lawyer read the document out loud, as if listening to that sound could somehow drown out the words coming out of his mouth. My name is Claire. I was 38 years old that day, and I had spent the last 6 years of my life driving 40 minutes every single Sunday to sit with my father while his memory slipped further away from him, to fill his pill organizer, to argue with insurance companies on his behalf, to sit in hospital waiting rooms with a paperback I never actually read because I was too busy watching the clock. My brother Marcus visited twice a year, Christmas and sometimes his birthday if nothing better came up. So when the lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Halloran who had known our family for almost 30 years, read the line that said the entire estate, the house, the investment accounts, my father's small but successful hardware business, was to go to my brother Marcus, and that I was to receive, and I remember this word specifically because it felt like it had been chosen with surgical precision, nothing. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I sat very still, the way you do when you've been in a car accident and your body hasn't caught up yet to what your mind already knows. My mother, sitting 2 chairs away from me, did not look surprised. That was the first thing that struck me as strange. Grief does strange things to people's faces, but what I saw on my mother's face was not grief, and it was not even guilt. It was something closer to relief, like she had been holding her breath for a long time, and had finally been allowed to let it out. Marcus, for his part, looked down at his hands. He didn't smile, but he didn't object either. He didn't say, "Wait, that's not right, she took care of Dad for years, she deserves something." He just sat there, quiet, the way you sit when you already know the ending of a story. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further, because I think it matters for what comes later. I am not a person who makes scenes. I did not stand up in that office and demand answers. I thanked Mr. Halloran for his time. I hugged my mother goodbye even though the hug felt like hugging a mannequin, and I drove home in silence, the radio off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached by the time I pulled into my driveway. My husband Tom was waiting for me on the porch. He took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. He just opened his arms and I stood there in the doorway of our small house, in the town where I had lived my entire life, and I let myself cry for the first time since my father had died. Not because of the money. I want to be very clear about that because it would be so easy for you to think this story is about money, and it isn't, not really. I cried because for 6 years I had told myself that showing up mattered. That love, the quiet, unglamorous, exhausting kind of love that shows up every single Sunday with a fresh bag of his favorite butterscotch candies, counted for something. And in one afternoon, in one document typed up by a lawyer, I had been told that it counted for nothing at all. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying small moments from the last few years, searching them for some clue I had missed. My father in his recliner patting my hand and saying, "You're the only one who understands me anymore, Claire Bear." My mother calling me at 11 at night because my father had wandered into the backyard in his pajamas, and me being the one who drove over immediately while Marcus, when I called him, said he had an early meeting and couldn't make it. None of it made sense. And that is where this story really begins. Not with the will. With the question that kept me awake that night and for many nights afterward. Why? The mystery didn't stay a mystery for very long, or at least I didn't think it would. I assumed in my naivety that if I simply asked my mother directly, she would tell me the truth. I drove to my parents' house, my mother's house now I suppose, 3 days after the will reading, and I sat with her at the kitchen table where I had eaten breakfast as a child, where the wallpaper still had the same faded rooster pattern from 1994, and I asked her plainly why. My mother did not meet my eyes. She busied herself with the kettle, with the tea bags, with anything that kept her hands occupied and her back half turned to me. She said something about your father made his decisions, Claire, and I wasn't going to argue with a dying man's wishes. She said it in a tone that suggested the conversation was already over, that I had committed some kind of rudeness simply by asking. But here is the thing about my mother. I had known her my entire life, and I knew the difference between the way she spoke when she was telling the truth and the way she spoke when she was protecting something. When she said your father made his decisions, Her voice had the careful, rehearsed quality of a line that had been practiced in a mirror. And when I pushed a little further when I asked what had changed, because I distinctly remembered my father telling me, only 2 years earlier, sitting in that same recliner, that the house would be split between me and Marcus evenly, my mother's hand trembled slightly around the handle of the teapot, just for a second, and she said, "Some things are complicated and you wouldn't understand." You wouldn't understand. I have turned that phrase over in my mind so many times since then. Because it wasn't dismissive in the way it sounds. It was almost protective. Like she was trying to keep something away from me, not because I didn't deserve to know it, but because she was afraid of what it would do to me if I did. I didn't get anything else out of her that day. I drove home more unsettled than before because now I had confirmation that something had happened, some event or decision, somewhere in those last 2 years, that had rewritten my entire relationship with my father's estate, and nobody was willing to tell me what it was. For the next several nights I found myself doing something I am not proud of, though I don't regret it either. I started pulling out old photographs, old birthday cards, anything with a date on it, trying to build a timeline in my head of when things had started to shift. I found a birthday card from my father, dated almost exactly 2 years before he died, where he had written in his familiar looping handwriting, "My Claire Bear, the only one of my children who still calls just to talk, not because she needs something." I remember reading that card again with fresh eyes, and feeling a strange cold recognition settle into my stomach. That was not the voice of a man planning to erase me from anything. That was a man who, at that point in time, still saw me exactly the way I saw myself in our relationship. Something had happened between that birthday card and the will reading. Somewhere in that gap, an entire version of my father's intentions had been quietly rewritten, and I was determined to find out how. I started paying closer attention in the weeks that followed to the way my mother spoke about that period of time whenever it came up in conversation, even in passing. I noticed she always described it the same way, almost word for word, as if she had rehearsed the phrasing until it no longer felt like something she was hiding, but simply something she had come to believe. Your father's memory started slipping badly around then. He got confused about all sorts of things. It was a hard time for all of us. It was the kind of sentence that sounded true on the surface, and yet never quite matched the man I had spent every Sunday with during those exact months. A man who, difficult as his decline eventually became, was still sharp enough in that period to beat me at gin rummy 3 games out of 5. I called my Aunt Ruth that weekend. She was my father's younger sister, the only person in the family who had never learned to keep her opinions to herself, and the only person besides Mr. Halloran who I trusted to tell me something close to the truth. Aunt Ruth was quiet on the phone for a long moment when I asked her if she knew anything, and that silence told me more than her eventual answer did. She said, "Claire, I don't know the details, but about 1.5 years ago, your father called me very upset, saying he needed to talk to Mr. Halloran about changing some paperwork. He wouldn't tell me what it was about. He just kept saying he'd been shown something that changed everything. I asked him what he meant, and he got quiet and said he'd rather not say over the phone. He'd been shown something." Those words lodged themselves in my chest like a splinter. Shown something by whom? About what? I thought about my father in his final years, his memory softening at the edges like a photograph left out in the sun. Easily confused, easily led. I thought about how often Marcus had started visiting more frequently right around that time, not weekly, not the way I did, but more than his usual twice a year. I thought about how my mother had started handling more and more of the household paperwork, taking over bill payments and bank statements that used to be my father's domain. I want to pause here and say something important. I did not, at this point, suspect my brother of anything sinister. I want you to understand that about me. I am not a person who leaps to conclusions about the people I love, even when those people have hurt me. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe my father, in his declining state, had simply grown paranoid, had misremembered some slight from years ago and decided, in a moment of confusion, to change his will. Grief and confusion make people do strange things, and I was prepared to accept a mundane, sad explanation. But mundane, sad explanations don't usually come with locked drawers. It was 2 weeks after the will reading that I went back to my parents' house to help my mother sort through some of my father's belongings. His clothes, his old fishing gear, boxes of photographs that needed to be organized. My mother had asked for my help, which surprised me, given how tense things had been between us, but I think in her own way she still needed me, even if she couldn't say so directly. We were in my father's old study. A small room off the back of the house that had always smelled like pipe tobacco even though he'd quit smoking a pipe 15 years earlier. I was going through his desk and in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old tax returns, I found a small metal lockbox. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was simply there, tucked beneath papers the way you might tuck away anything you didn't want to look at every day but weren't ready to throw away. I asked my mother if she knew what was in it. She glanced at it and I saw something flicker across her face. Not surprise but a kind of tired resignation, as if she had been waiting for me to find it and dreading it at the same time. She said, "That's your father's." I never had the key. He kept that locked up tight even from me. I believed her. My mother was many things, but she had never been a particularly good liar. And in that moment, watching her look at that box with genuine unfamiliarity, I understood that whatever was inside it, she truly did not know. I took the lockbox home with me that night. Tom found a small pick set online, the kind locksmiths use for old cabinet locks, and after 20 minutes of careful, frustrating work at our kitchen table, the lock finally gave way with a soft click that felt, in that quiet house, unreasonably loud. Inside was a manila folder, slightly yellowed at the edges, and beneath it, a stack of documents held together with a rubber band that had grown brittle with age. On the front of the folder, in my father's careful old-fashioned handwriting, were 3 words that I will never forget as long as I live. For Claire eventually. For Claire eventually. Not for Marcus. Not for my mother. For me. And that single word, eventually, told me that my father had known, even as he wrote it, that this was not something meant to be found right away. It was something meant to wait. Something he wasn't ready for me to see while he was still alive to answer for it. I sat at my kitchen table with Tom beside me, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the folder, and what I found inside changed everything I thought I understood about the last 6 years of my life. The first thing I saw was a series of bank statements from an account I had never known existed. A business account tied to my father's hardware store, dated back nearly 3 years. Attached to the statements, clipped with a small binder clip, was a handwritten note in my father's shaking script that simply said, "Transfers Marcus said were for inventory." I never approved these amounts. I spread the statements out across the table, and Tom and I went through them line by line. There were transfers, dozens of them over an 18-month period, each one modest enough on its own to avoid drawing much attention. $400 here, $600 there, occasionally larger amounts around $1,100 or $1,200, but added together they came to just over $63,000, all funneled out of the hardware store's business account and into an account under Marcus's name. Beneath the bank statements was something that made my stomach drop even further. A series of printed emails between Marcus and a man named Gary Preston, who I recognized as a business associate my father had mentioned once or twice, someone Marcus had introduced as a potential partner for expanding the hardware store into a second location. The emails, dated over the same period as the strange transfers, discussed something called restructuring the ownership stake before the old man notices, and referenced adjusting Dad's understanding of the numbers since he doesn't really follow the books closely anymore. I read that phrase 3 times. Adjusting Dad's understanding of the numbers. My father, a man who had built that hardware store from a single rented storefront in 1987 into a business that employed 11 people. A man who had once been sharp enough to calculate profit margins in his head faster than the store's own computer system, was being described in these emails as someone whose understanding could simply be adjusted, like a thermostat. There was more. A copy of a letter, this one typed and signed by my father, dated about 14 months before he died, addressed to Mr. Halloran, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss what he called irregularities I've discovered in the business accounts and some concerns about my son's honesty that I need to address before I'm no longer able to. My hands were shaking by the time I got to that line. Before I'm no longer able to. My father had known even then that his mind was slipping, and he had been racing against his own decline to protect something. But here is the part that truly broke something open in me. Tucked at the very back of the folder was a single handwritten page, dated only 6 weeks before my father's mind had deteriorated to the point where the doctor said he could no longer reliably make legal decisions. It was addressed simply to me. Claire, if you're reading this, it means I never found the right moment to tell you myself, and for that I'm sorry. I found out about a year ago that Marcus has been taking money from the business, small amounts, but it added up, and when I confronted him he cried and told me he was in debt, real trouble, the kind of trouble that scared me for him. I told him I would forgive it, quietly, If he was honest with me going forward. He wasn't. I found more transfers after that conversation. I don't know everything he told your mother, but I think he convinced her I was starting to imagine things, that my memory was worse than it was, because after that she started questioning me too gently, the way you question someone you think might be losing their grip. I started to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I was imagining it. I want you to know I wasn't. I changed the will because your mother came to me very distressed, saying that if I left everything to you and cut Marcus out for what I'd found, it would destroy this family, that Marcus needed the security more than you did because you and Tom were stable and he wasn't, and that I should protect the family's peace instead of stirring up an accusation I might be misremembering anyway. I was tired, Claire. I was so tired and scared of my own mind, and I let her convince me it was easier to change the paperwork than to fight about something I could no longer prove with certainty in my own head. I am ashamed of that. I want you to have this folder because I could never bring myself to say it to your face while I was strong enough to say it clearly. You were the one who showed up. I know that. I have always known that. I love you both, but only one of you ever earned my trust, and I let fear take that decision out of my hands. Fix it if you can. I'm sorry I couldn't. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 4 in the morning, reading that letter over and over, feeling something shift inside me that I can only describe as a door swinging open after being locked for a very long time. I had spent 6 years wondering if my devotion to my father had meant anything at all. And now I understood that it had meant everything to him, right up until fear and manipulation had taken the pen out of his hand. I did not want revenge in the way you might expect. I did not want to scream at my brother, or humiliate my mother, or drag our family's private grief into some public spectacle. What I wanted more than anything was for the truth to simply exist in the open, where it could no longer be quietly denied. I wanted my father's real wishes, the ones he had written down in his own hand while he was still lucid enough to know exactly what he meant, to matter more than the version of events my mother and brother had constructed to protect themselves. I called Mr. Halloran the next morning. I did not tell him everything over the phone. I simply asked if he had time to meet, and if he still had the paperwork related to my father's mental capacity evaluations from the years leading up to his death. There was a pause on the line and then he said quietly, "Claire, I think it's time we talk properly. I have something I probably should have told you sooner, and I think you might have something you should tell me too." When I arrived at his office 2 days later, carrying the folder in a plain envelope, Mr. Halloran told me something that filled in the last missing piece of the puzzle. He said that about 14 months before my father passed, my father had indeed come to him, agitated and worried, wanting to discuss changing his will to exclude Marcus entirely and leave everything to me, exactly as the letter had described. Mr. Halloran had scheduled a follow-up appointment to formalize it. But my father never returned. 2 months later, my mother called Mr. Halloran's office instead, alone, explaining that my father's memory had worsened considerably, that the family had decided together it would be best to simplify things, and requesting the will be redrawn with Marcus as the sole beneficiary, citing my father's wishes to, quote, keep the business in the hands of the child who understood it best. Mr. Halloran said he had asked to speak with my father directly before making any changes, as was standard practice, and that when he did, my father had seemed confused, tired, agreeable to whatever was placed in front of him, nodding along as my mother explained the new arrangement in the room beside him. Mr. Halloran told me, with what sounded like real regret in his voice, that at the time, it had seemed like a family simply making difficult decisions together during a hard season. He had no way of knowing there was a manipulated financial record, a frightened dying man, and a controlling narrative sitting underneath that calm surface. I laid the folder out on his desk. The bank statements, the emails between Marcus and Gary Preston, my father's original letter to Mr. Halloran describing the irregularities, and finally, the handwritten letter addressed to me. Mr. Halloran read every page in silence, his expression growing more solemn with each one, and when he finished, he looked up at me and said, "This changes things considerably, Claire. This isn't just a family disagreement. This is evidence of financial misconduct, and possibly undue influence on a man whose testamentary capacity was already in documented decline. We have options here, and I want you to know you have every right to pursue them." Before I left his office that day, Mr. Halloran pulled one more file from his cabinet, almost as an afterthought, and slid it across the desk toward me. It was a copy of the capacity evaluation my father had undergone roughly 8 months before he died, ordered according to the paperwork at my mother's request, ostensibly to help the family plan for his care. The evaluating physician's notes described my father as oriented to person and place, with mild short-term memory impairment consistent with early-stage decline, but capable of expressing clear and consistent preferences when given adequate time and a calm environment. I read that line twice. Clear and consistent preferences. That was the man who, according to my mother's version of events, had been too confused to be trusted with his own will just months later. The timeline did not add up, and Mr. Halloran, to his credit, said so himself quietly, almost to himself, as though he were only now allowing himself to see the shape of what had actually happened. I spent that entire weekend going through every document a second time, and then a third laying them out across our dining room table in careful chronological order, the way you might lay out pieces of a puzzle before you're sure they all belong to the same picture. Tom helped me build a simple spreadsheet, dates down one column, transfer amounts down another, matching each one against the emails between Marcus and Gary Preston, and against the increasingly worried notes in my father's own handwriting scattered throughout the folder. Somewhere around midnight on that second night, sitting in the soft glow of the kitchen light with a cold cup of tea in front of me, I finally saw the entire shape of it clearly, laid out in black and white, undeniable. My brother had taken money he wasn't owed, quietly and repeatedly, and when our father began to notice instead of confessing, he had allowed our mother's fear about our father's mind to do the covering up for him. I sat with that for a long moment. Because here is the truth about quiet revenge, the kind that actually satisfies something deep inside you instead of just burning everything down around you. It isn't about winning a legal battle for the sake of winning. It's about making sure the truth cannot be buried any longer, and letting the people who buried it feel the weight of it finally being uncovered, in their own time, in their own way. I told Mr. Halloran I wanted one thing before we discussed contesting anything legally. I wanted a family meeting with him present as a neutral party, where I would lay out exactly what I had found, in front of both my mother and my brother, without accusation, without yelling, simply with the documents themselves doing the talking. Mr. Halloran agreed, and honestly, I think some part of him wanted to witness it too, after decades of trusting my family's version of events. The meeting took place on a Thursday evening in Mr. Halloran's conference room, the kind of sterile, quiet room with a long table and a pitcher of water nobody ever touches. My mother arrived first, looking smaller than I remembered her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcus arrived a few minutes later, glancing between me and Mr. Halloran with the kind of forced casualness people wear when they suspect something is wrong but don't yet know what. I did not raise my voice once during that meeting. I want to be very clear about that because I think it matters. I laid the bank statements out first, sliding them gently across the table toward Marcus, and I asked him calmly if he could explain the pattern of transfers from the business account into his personal account over that 18-month period. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as he looked down at the numbers, at dates he clearly remembered, at a paper trail he had believed, I think, had died along with our father's failing memory. He started to speak, some fragmented explanation about a loan he'd always intended to pay back, about how Dad had said it was fine, and I simply slid the printed emails across the table next to the statements. I did not say a single accusatory word. I let the phrase adjusting Dad's understanding of the numbers sit there on the page in his own handwriting, in his own words, doing all the speaking that needed to be done. My mother had gone very still beside him, staring at the emails, and I think that was the first moment she truly understood the scale of what had happened, because up until then, I believe some part of her had genuinely convinced herself that she was protecting her son from a temporary lapse, not covering for a pattern of calculated theft. I placed my father's letter to Mr. Halloran on the table next, the one describing his concerns about Marcus's honesty, written while he was still lucid, still sharp enough to notice discrepancies in his own store's books. And then finally, I placed the handwritten letter addressed to me, the last thing my father had written with clarity, and I asked my mother gently if she would like to read it, or if she would prefer that I read it aloud. She read it herself in silence, and when she finished, her hands were trembling around the paper, and for the first time in 6 years, I saw my mother cry in a way that wasn't performative or self-protective. It was the sound of someone confronting something they had spent a long time convincing themselves wasn't true. She said very quietly, "I thought I was protecting this family. I thought your father was confused, And I thought if I just kept the peace, kept us all together, it would be better in the end than tearing everything apart over money. I didn't want to believe Marcus would do something like that. I told myself I was choosing family over an accusation I couldn't be sure of. I slid the capacity evaluation across the table then, the one Mr. Halloran had shown me days earlier, and I asked her, as gently as I could manage, why she had requested that evaluation only months before insisting the will be changed, when the doctor's own notes described a man capable of expressing clear and consistent preferences. She stared at the page for a long time without speaking. I watched something in her expression shift, the way ice shifts right before it cracks, slow and then sudden all at once. She finally said in a voice barely above a whisper, that Marcus had come to her first, before she ever spoke to any doctor, crying, telling her he was terrified their father was going to accuse him of something in front of the whole family over what he called a misunderstanding about the business accounts. She said she had believed him completely, because believing the alternative had felt unbearable to her. I wanted so badly for it to be a misunderstanding, she said, that I stopped asking the kinds of questions that would have proven it wasn't. Mr. Halloran, who had mostly stayed silent up to that point, letting the documents do the talking, finally spoke. He said, gently but firmly, that regardless of anyone's intentions in the moment, the pattern in front of us showed a vulnerable man's clearly stated wishes being quietly overridden while he was still legally and medically capable of expressing them. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it the way you might point out that a bridge everyone had assumed was solid actually had a crack running clean through its foundation, a fact simply waiting to be acknowledged. I told her, and I meant this with my whole heart, that I understood the fear of losing her family. I told her that I wasn't there to tear anything apart either. I was there because the truth mattered more than the comfortable version of events we had all been living inside for the past several years, and because my father, in the last clear-headed months of his life, had trusted me with that truth, and I owed it to him to finally let it exist in daylight. Marcus did not deny it after that. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when they realize the story they've been telling themselves no longer holds together, and that was the silence that filled the room. He put his head in his hands and after a long moment, he admitted it. All of it. The debt he'd fallen into from bad investments, the small transfers that grew into large ones, the fear of admitting it to our father, and the choice, made slowly and cowardly over many months, to let our mother believe our father's memory was worse than it truly was, because it was easier than facing what he had done. I did not demand he go to prison. I did not demand my mother be punished for her fear. What I asked for in that quiet conference room was simple. I asked Mr. Halloran to formally document everything we had found, and I asked that the estate be handled the way my father had actually wanted it handled, based on the letter he had left specifically for that purpose, with Mr. Halloran overseeing a fair resolution that accounted for the misappropriated funds. Marcus, to his credit in that one moment at least, did not fight it. I think some small buried part of him had been waiting to be caught for a very long time, and there was almost relief in finally setting the weight of it down. In the weeks that followed, the estate was restructured under Mr. Halloran's guidance. The $63,000 Marcus had taken was accounted for and deducted from his share. The house, which my father had originally intended to be split evenly between us before fear and manipulation rewrote that plan, was divided according to his true wishes. It was not about the money for me, and I want to say that honestly because by the time it was all settled, the amount I received barely changed my life financially. What changed was something far more important. My father's real voice, the one that had been silenced by confusion and fear in his final years, was finally allowed to be heard. My relationship with Marcus is not what it once was, and I don't know if it ever will be again. We are civil. We exchange holiday messages. He has slowly, in small and imperfect ways, tried to make amends, and I have let him because I don't believe punishing someone forever serves anyone, especially not the memory of a father who, even in his letter to me, said he still loved us both. But trust, once it's been quietly dismantled the way his was, does not rebuild itself overnight, and I've made peace with the fact that some distance between us may simply be permanent. My relationship with my mother healed slower, but it healed more honestly than I expected. She apologized to me many times in the months that followed, not with excuses, but with a kind of raw honesty I hadn't seen from her before. She told me once, sitting at that same kitchen table with the faded rooster wallpaper, that she had spent so many years believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the family whole, and that finding out those were two very different things had been one of the hardest lessons of her life. I believe her. I think fear made her complicit in something she never would have chosen on her own, and I think in her own way, she has spent every day since trying to earn back the trust she let slip away. I think about my father often now, more gently than I did in the weeks right after the will reading. I think about him sitting alone in that study, writing that letter with hands that he must have known were beginning to fail him, racing against a clock only he could feel ticking, trying to leave behind one last piece of truth before the world around him decided his memory could no longer be trusted. I think about the words for Claire eventually, and how much faith it must have taken for him to trust that eventually would come, that I would find that folder, that I would understand. I did understand. It took a locked box, a folder of bank statements, a string of damning emails, and a letter written in shaking handwriting, but I understood. And more than the money, more than the house, more than any material thing that folder led to, what I carry with me now is the certainty that my father saw me clearly, right up until the end, even when the rest of the world had decided he couldn't see anything clearly at all. He knew who showed up. He knew who loved him without needing anything in return. And when he no longer had the strength to say it out loud, he found a way to write it down and wait patiently for the truth to find its way to me. Some inheritances aren't about what ends up in your bank account. Sometimes the real inheritance is simply being seen, finally and completely, by someone who loved you enough to make sure the truth outlived his own fading memory. That is what my father left me. And it turned out to be worth more than anything a will could have ever divided.